Hi guys, Asmo here and welcome to part 2 of my Toxic Rain Caustic Arrow Pathfinder guide. This is a part 2 of the guide. In the description you can find the link to part 1, which covers the leveling process in great detail. And in this part I'm going to cover the build overview, priorities after getting to maps, playstyle options, tips and tricks for solo self-found, how to scale Toxic Rain damage, skill gems, passive skill points and cluster jewels, and item progression and which stats to look for and how to achieve the min-maxed setup. Toxic Rain Caustic Arrow Pathfinder is, in my opinion, the best league starter build in the game, mainly because of how comfortable and easy it is to play. It has very fast clear speed, easy bossing, good survivability. It is able to do all map modes without any adjustments, without exceptions. It has great quality of life and it's easy and comfortable to play. It works great as a league starter with zero budget. It is hardcore and solo self-found viable. It can be leveled with the same skill from the very beginning of the game until maps, and it scales very well into the late game, reaching millions of DPS if you wanna invest into it. So I definitely recommend this build to anyone who's either new to PoE or simply wants the most well-rounded league starter capable of doing all content. There are multiple ways to set up the skills which you're going to be using for clear and for bossing. When you get to maps, at first you maybe are going to be using the CA as your main skill, the Caustic Arrow, and then Toxic Rain Ballistas for single target on bosses. And the benefit of the Toxic Rain Ballistas is the sustained damage you get without having to constantly attack yourself. This way you're also not limited by your mana, because spamming self-cast Toxic Rain without an enduring mana flask can lead to some mana issues and therefore lower DPS on boss fights. You can also self-cast Caustic Arrow and self-cast Toxic Rain, but only one of those setups can be in your bow, which you will probably have something like +1 to bow level gems or +2 to bow level gems at that point, and so it's better to just use Toxic Rain in the Ballistas and Caustic Arrow in your bow, or completely switch to Toxic Rain, at which point you're gonna have the Wither totems instead of Ballistas for single target damage. So make sure to level the spell totem, multiple totem, support, faster casting, and Wither during the leveling. You can get them all from Act 6 Lily in Lion's Watch. Another playstyle choice has to do with using triggered attacks and spells or focusing on the pure Toxic Rain damage. In my opinion, it is better to use the triggered setup if you're going for low to medium investment, and focus on the Toxic Rain damage if you're going to min-max the build and scale the damage very high. The reason for this is the way that scaling damage works in PoE. For example, if your Toxic Rain does 1 million DPS, then adding extra 600,000 from the triggered spells and attacks is better than increasing your Toxic Rain damage by like 30%, which in this case would be extra 300,000 DPS. However, once you reach very high damage, let's say 10 million DPS, then increasing your damage by 30% means adding extra 3 million damage, 3 million DPS, which is going to be a bigger number than the damage from the triggered spells and attacks at this point. So that's why this is better in like a low to medium damage investment, and then you switch to regular rare crafted helmets and quiver later on when you scale the damage higher. That being said, early on the Asenath chant and Maloney mechanism are very strong. They automatically trigger socketed abilities whenever you attack, which means that this setup is most effective with Quill Rain. That will also be something that we are using early on, and I recommend putting Despair Curse in your Asenath chant until you get the curse on hit ring, and then adding Essence Drain and Soul Rend, all supported by efficacy, which will boost the damage as well as duration of both of them. And in the Maloney's mechanism, I recommend putting Caustic Arrow with Arrow Nova and Vicious Projectiles for amazing boost to your clear, and for boss fights you should swap the Arrow Nova for Frenzy to generate frenzy charges when you cannot rely on Blood Rage. So now let's talk about the TR damage scaling. What can you do to increase the damage of your main skill, the Toxic Rain? You can use, of course, many of the generic forms of increased damage, increased projectile damage, which also scales the dot component of this skill that we care about, increased chaos damage, and increased chaos damage over time. These additive bonuses will boost your base damage from the skill, but to boost the base damage itself, you can also get +2 levels of Toxic Rain, which will make the base damage higher, making all of the other bonuses even more effective. It is worth getting a bow with +2 levels of Toxic Rain, Empower, and also bonuses to levels of all Chaos and Dexterity skill gems on your Amulet, for example. After that, you want to make sure that you're stacking Chaos damage or damage over time multiplier, which is going to be a much better stat than simply increased Chaos damage over time, since the increased damage mods are added together and they scale your base damage, but the multiplier mods scale the total amount of damage you do, so they are much better in the end. All of that will increase the damage over time of each of your pods, and you can also improve your damage by adding increase effect duration. The base duration of your dots is 1 second, and increasing that will increase how long the pods last on the ground, which doesn't really change the DPS of a single pod, but allows you to stack more pods at the same time, and with more pods dealing damage, your DPS will increase. And speaking of more pods, the next way to scale your TR damage is to add more of them by adding more arrows. Each extra arrow you fire will add an extra pod, however, since they spread more or less evenly, you will need to compensate for it with extra AoE. Adding more AoE allows your pods to overlap, and the more AoE, the more pods can overlap, and ideally you want all of them to overlap, so you will need a lot of AoE to make sure that all of them are actually dealing damage to the intended target. That's why something like Carcass Jack is an incredibly good item for this build, and same goes for the Dying Sun Flasks, which adds extra arrows as well as the AoE, because AoE is very important for maximizing your DPS. And last but not least, we can scale our damage by increasing the attack speed. Since the pod damage overlaps, we want to deploy as many of them as humanly possible, and that's why something like Quill Rain is a great and cheap option whenever you switch to self-casting Toxic Rain, as long as you can sustain the mana cost. Getting to maps, you want to make sure that you cap your resists and try to get a 5 link early on, either on a Grove Bow with +2 levels of bow skill gems, if you're still sticking with the Caustic Arrow for clear, or Quill Rain if you're switching to Toxic Rain as your main skill. You will also need an Enduring Mana Flask or Enduring Hybrid Flask. Mana is going to be better early on because it offers more charges and longer duration, which is great for boss fights, for example, but once you get the required oils for Hardened Scars anointment, you will switch to the Hybrid Flask, making sure that you have well-rolled flask should be your priority. After getting Quill Rain, which costed about 1 or 2 C at the start of this league, your next important items are Carcass Jack and Atsiri Step Boots, or another decent pair of 30% movement speed boots. To get Carcass Jack cheaper, you can also buy or farm the Scavenger Divination cards, but more of that in a SSF section in a moment. With those few key items, your build is really going to kick off. So let's talk about SSF. In SSF, you can comfortably acquire all of the necessary items. Everything is just going to take a little bit longer. First of all, make sure that you're picking up your silver coins and doing your prophecies. The craft mods from prophecy chains are extremely useful in SSF, and you can also keep an eye out for the Asenath's Chant Prophecy. Betrayal is another very important mechanic which can help you acquire many more uniques, and with more unique drops you're more likely to get the Asenath's Mark, Quill Rain, Carcass Jack, as well as the Betrayal specific drop, Maloney's Mechanism Quiver. All very useful for this build. You should also do normal Atsiri as soon as you're comfortable tackling the fight for the Atsiri Step Boots. And you can farm the Carcass Jack Divination cards, which drop from unique bosses in the Aqueduct Zone and the Channel, Chateau and Underground River maps. If you want to increase your chances at dropping these divination cards, you can run these maps with the Twinned mod, which will give you 2 bosses at the end of that map, doubling your chances at getting the Carcass Jack Divination cards. Anytime you get the Deadly Twins Prophecy, you should prioritize doing one of those maps. Also, make sure that you use either Craft of Exile or PoEDB websites, which I will link in the description, to check the required item levels for crafting what you need on your items. For example, as soon as you get an item level 75 plus Hunter influenced ring, you should try to get a Despair Curse on hit on it, which will massively boost your damage. Now let's talk about the meat and potatoes of the build, which are going to be the skill gems, passive skill tree, and items. I'll be using an extremely min-maxed POB for this, but keep in mind that this is a pie-in-the-sky setup that probably nobody will achieve, so try not to pay too much attention to the DPS number. DPS for Toxic Rain is like a very tricky thing to calculate, it's just there for reference. This is basically as perfect as I could make this build in terms of damage, survivability, utility, clear speed, etc. It dishes out millions of damage while still maintaining the permanent flask uptime on bosses, which means permanent fortify on bosses, a lot of the movement speed, attack speed for comfortable playstyle, 90% chaos res with divine flesh on top of it all, which adds a lot of mitigation, and we also get 73% attack dodge, 63% spell dodge, so the avoidance is also there. Overall, an absolutely insane package. So let us go through this POB and I'll explain everything from a point of view of progression, telling you all the steps and ways to set up and improve this build. So we're gonna start with the skill gems. Toxic Rain, of course, you wanna get it as high level as you can. You should really prioritize getting item level 21. So whenever you have free green sockets and your offhand sockets and your offhand weapons, you should level Toxic Rain and try to get level 21 as soon as possible. And then if possible, get the Phantasmal one, because the extra 2 arrows with the extra AoE that we're getting, being able to benefit from all of the arrows is crazy. Like the extra 2 arrows is a massive multiplier, so the Phantasmal one is the best. Then we've got Awakened Vicious Projectiles. Before you can get the Awakened version, of course, you're gonna be using the normal Vicious Projectiles, same with Void Manipulation, same with Swift Affliction. All of those you use first the normal version and then the Awakened, and then we're gonna be using Empower once you get either item level 4 or you get a bow with also +2 to support skill gems. Before you get the Empower, you can use Efficacy. So Efficacy is going to be your 6th link normally. And then normally you're going to start with using Mirage Archer, right? Mirage Archer is going to be what you're starting with. And once your setup is high enough damage, and once you need more AoE, you can run something like Awakened Increased Area of Effect. This is in the very end game setup, but overall for single target, for boss damage, in the end, if you're doing something like a Cyrus, you can kind of stack a lot of pods. If you have increased duration, this will also increase the duration of the pod's damage over time. So as long as the boss is not jumping around too much, because for that maybe you want either the Awakened Increased AoE or Mirage Archer, the increased duration is just going to be the most pure raw damage. So that's when it comes to like the Toxic Rain, and you want to make sure that you socket it in the bow, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. The spare is going to ideally come from the ring. Then we've got Wither Totem setup. For Wither Totem, we want faster casting, spell totem, multiple totems. You can go for either the regular version, which will give you increased totem placement speed, or the anomalous one, which will give you increased totem duration. I prefer the anomalous because you can put them a little bit earlier before the boss and then make sure that you stack your pods, so it's a little bit easier to use for me that way, but it doesn't really matter that much. Just get them as high level as you can, depending on the stats that you have, because they have pretty high int requirement, so you're gonna need some int on your gear if you want to have them as high level as possible. Then we've got the aura setup, which normally will sit in your chest, probably in the carcass jack, and that will be supported by Enlighten level 4 to reduce the reservation. Early on you're gonna not have that, so you're probably gonna have to skip some of it, but early on the most important one is Malevolence and Flesh and Stone. Malevolence is gonna give you most damage. Anomalous Malevolence also gives you the increased skill effect duration, which is very strong. This is like, at this point, and with this is like multiple millions of damage. Like we can see, this is, yeah, like 4 millions of damage on this with these calculations. So like percentage wise, it's a decent increase. Then we've got Flesh and Stone. It's a very good defensive mechanic. Like you got blind around you, reduce damage taken from projectiles outside. It's very powerful. Then we've got Scatterbots for the shock and chill. Scatterbots are very important as well. We've got Vitality for some regen as high level as your mana can support, and Precision. You might be wondering, like, why do you have Precision? We do damage over time. We don't care about the hits. We care about the hits and the crits for the purpose of getting Tailwind and Elusive, because we have Boots, that give us Tailwind and Elusive. We need to be regularly critting, and with this setup you are critting often enough with like precision level 20. You're gonna be critting and hitting often enough that you're gonna be actually constantly getting Tailwind and Elusive. Even on boss fights, even on single target, you're gonna be maintaining your not Elusive, the other one, what's it called again? Tailwind, right? So you're gonna be getting Tailwind 100%. Next, we've got our mobility setup, so that will be dash and smoke mine with second wind. This is extremely good. What you want to do is like drop a smoke mine, and then as long as you have the movement speed buff, you just keep running and using the dash, and then also Val haste, because this gives us a massive boost to attack speed that we can pop on bosses. This is very, very useful as well, or when we want to like quickly run through something. In terms of the different options here, the anomalous one gives you increased travel distance. I prefer that one. Smoke mine, actually divergent smoke mine, gives you 10% attack speed, so that is something that can actually increase your damage. So you might actually want to use the smoke mine before a boss fight. That will also increase your damage. So that is another very important thing. That's like very tiny, very minor, but still, if we switch that, that's like 4 million damage, okay, on this setup. So it will be like thousands of damage for you that you might potentially gain. And then we've got a cast when damage taken Immortal Call with increased duration, and with Blood Rage, which also is supported by the increased duration. So Blood Rage will normally give you the extra attack speed, which is very, very good, and then during mapping it will give you frenzy charges. And of course, Immortal Call, cast when damage taken, very standard, just taking less damage. So that's it when it comes to the gems. Those are pretty much like the perfect gems that we're running. Let's go to the skill tree. In the passive skill tree, the cluster jewels are very, very strong. Cluster jewels are what we want to prioritize. I have posted POB that shows us taking like different skills, like growth and decay, taking lethal assault, taking no witnesses. Those are very good nodes, but once you get to a maximum like setup with these cluster jewels, then this is kind of what you want to do. There are two different large cluster jewels that I would recommend using. One is the bow one, which will give you the broadside, which is 25% increased AoE, which is pretty large amount, and then also tempered arrowheads, which gives you 10% dot multi and also increased skill effect duration. So this is very, very powerful. 20% skill effect duration, 10% dot multi. This is massive. This is absolutely massive. So tempered arrowheads is huge. And then the other large cluster jewel option is the chaos one, increased chaos damage, which can give you touch of cruelty. That means whenever you hit your opponents, you're gonna be able to hinder them, and when you hinder them, they take 10% increased chaos damage. That is essentially 10% multiplier, because enemies taking 10% works on the total of the damage you're dealing, so it's like 10% more instead of 10% increase. So this is a massive addition that you can stack on top of everything. And then also Wicked Pal, which is a great passive node that we have from these cluster jewels, which increases the duration and chaos damage, and also Unholy Grace, which is chaos damage and attack speed, all things that we really, really want. Then in terms of the medium cluster jewels, you want to make sure that you're getting Brood for potency, and here I have 1, 2, and 3 of, no, actually 2 of them only. So the amount of them will depend on other passives that you have. Essentially what we're trying to accomplish is having at least 100% increased flask charges gained. This is because of the Nature's Boon. So instead of getting 3 charges every 3 seconds, we're gonna be gaining 6 charges every 3 seconds. This will be massive for permanently sustaining your flasks on bosses. So getting enough Brood for potency. Also, if you look at these nodes that we're taking here, here is like flask duration and flask charges gained. This is also flask charges gained. I think there's like reduced flask charges used, and then flask charges gained somewhere else here. So this is what you want to stack. Stack flask charges gained until you have 100%. And another important node for that is the spiked concoction. So this is a medium cluster jewel. for Flasks, which gives you Flask Duration. You want one of those at least, which gives you Spiked Concoction and Brute for Potency. This is the combo you want. Brute for Potency, of course, also gives you increased damage over time and increased life and mana recovery from Flasks, which will boost your hybrid. Your little hybrid flask will actually do a lot of healing for you and a lot of mana recovery, so that will boost that as well. So 1 medium cluster jewel for Flask, 1 medium cluster jewels for damage over time, for Brute for Potency, and Brush with Death. I recommend that one because that's 10% damage over time multiplier, but you can also go for the combo with Wicked Pal. So you can do Wicked Pal with Brute Potency, or you can do also Flow of Life, which will give you some life regen and life on top of the increased damage over time. So those are the combos for medium cluster jewels. And then small cluster jewels, we need here Born of Chaos. That will be required if you are going for Divine Flesh in order to reach the 90% max Chaos res. Some of that will come from Born of Chaos, some of that max res will come from Method to Madness, and then the remainder you can get on a couple of places. You can get it on the Quiver, which normally is what you're going to be going for, like 2% to maximum chaos resistance, but you can also get 1% on Corruption on a chest, for example. So if you look here at the body armor, +1 to all maximum resistances will boost your chaos res as well as the elemental resistances. In terms of the skill tree, you can also get that from the Glorious Vanity. Somewhere in here you might have, for example, like this node having +1 to maximum chaos res. That will really depend on the roll on the Glorious Vanity, and it's kind of random. You basically need to test it or ask someone before they sell you, like, what does it give around here, so that they can tell you if you can get +1 to max chaos res as well. Other than the cluster jewels, we're going for acrobatics here. We're going for some like damage over time multiplier here. We're going for duration. So you get duration from here, skill effect duration, and you're getting it from here and from here. These nodes, which are being enabled by this Thread of Hope. This is very easy to acquire. As soon as you get Thread of Hope, even in SSF, when you kill Cyrus, depending on how available it's going to be with the new Atlas, you can divine your Thread of Hope into one that gives only affects passives in very large ring. And once you have the very large ring, of course, ideally you're gonna have like only -10 to all elemental resistances, but that will give you access to the duration, that will give you access to the Harrier node, which is all of attack speed and movement speed. That will also give you access to the Profane Chemistry, which is 6% max life, Flask effect, and also increased life recovery from Flasks, as well as also the Overcharge, which you can take if you have like some spare points, because that will give you power charges and endurance charges on top of frenzy charges on kill while you are mapping. Other than that, we are picking all of the nice jewel sockets here. The perfect jewel that you want is basically something that gives you chaos damage over time multiplier and then increased maximum life and attack speed. So you can get like generic attack speed and also attack speed with bows. And the ideal version, of course, is to have it corrupted with 5% increased AoE. And you can have like 4 of those. You can put them in these slots in the medium cluster jewels. You can put the one here, one here, one here, and that's basically it. We're also taking the Wind Dancer because it works well with our high avoidance, because we've got Elusive, we got Quartz Flask that has a lot of increased Flask effect, so it ends up giving us not just 10% dodge, but at least like 15% dodge. So that's going to be a lot of avoidance that will help with the Wind Dancer, that will give us some mitigation in return. So that's basically how the passive skill tree will look like. Also, we have here Watcher's Eye. This is like the ideal Watcher's Eye that you can get. What you want to look for in the beginning is just the damage over time multiplier while affected by malevolence. That's what you can get first. Once you have that one, you can look for like a super GG one like this one, which will also have like skill effect duration, which is massive, and also increased attack speed while affected by precision. That's another reason why we're also using precision, even though you don't have to level it to fully benefit from that. So that is it when it comes to the passive skill tree. Also the hardened scars, right? But that's kind of part of a gear, kind of part of a passive skill tree. You anoint that so that your enduring hybrid flask can persistently give you fortify while it is on, and with all the flask effect duration, with all the flask charges gained, with all the things that we're doing to flasks being Pathfinder, we are going to benefit from that and be able to have it constantly on. So constant fortify. In terms of the ascendancy points, first thing that you're going to go for is Nature's Reprisal. Of course, that is also covered, the order is covered in the leveling, but there are some differences that people go for. Like, a lot of people want to go for the Master Toxicist because of how much damage it deals. I prefer the Nature's Adrenaline. Like, if I switch this to this, yeah, we can see like 8 million DPS more. It's not gonna be 8 million because it's like ridiculous numbers, but like just a little bit of damage, a little bit more damage. However, I prefer the extra movement speed and the extra attack speed. Makes for much better playstyle, makes it so much easier to dodge different skills if you need to dodge something on a boss fight, and just improves your clear speed because you already have enough raw damage. And I would definitely not recommend skipping Master Alchemist. The ailment immunity is really important and freaking awesome to have. So this is very comfortable. Like, as you can see, you can still reach a lot of damage while still having like all of these utilities, all of this defense that we're getting here. And the last thing are, of course, the items. So one item that you probably gonna have like from the beginning until the end is like Carcass Jack. It's almost irreplaceable. It's so important, especially once you start stacking so many projectiles. You're gonna need the extra AoE, so I definitely recommend that. You can get some +2 level of skill gems. You can get +2 duration gems. If you get some like +2 duration gems on it, like +2 to duration gems and maybe +1 to AoE gems or something like that, you can actually put your Toxic Rain in it and use something like Quill Rain in the beginning. But in the end, the ideal one is like getting +1 to socketed gems and then also the max resistances. In terms of the bow, of course you can start with the Quill Rain, then later on you want to get something like +1 to socketed gems, damage over time multiplier, some attack speed, and then multi-craft +2 to level of socketed support gems and chaos damage over time multiplier. Of course, this is best on like a thicket bow or a grove bow. Thicket bow is like the best base. You want as fast base as possible, so the 1.5 attack speed bases. You can get something like this, which has synthesis base. The synthesis base is +1 to level of socketed support gems, or for example, you can get synthesis bases with increased chaos damage. You can get ones with increased attack speed, but that's gonna be very expensive. And then the most insane thing you can do on top of that is to annul the multi-craft and exalt slam something good on that. With the harvest crafting might be even more possible than before, but this is an absolutely insane bow, something like out of your dreams, crazy bow. But this is like the end game goal if you're trying to absolutely min-max the build, and it's absolutely massive. The quiver, usually you want to have the penetrating arrow quiver base in the beginning because that will allow you to penetrate with Caustic Arrow, which basically increases the AoE of that. But later on you want to get the crit so that you actually crit more often for your Tailwind and Elusive, so you can have like the crit base. And then we have damage over time multiplier, chaos damage over time multiplier, attack speed, maximum chaos res, additional arrow, and life. Instead of the max chaos res, you can also get AoE. You can get increased AoE on that, but we're going for divine flesh, so we're going for the max chaos res. In the beginning, of course, the progression is like you start with life and res, and then you have like damage over time multiplier or chaos damage over time multiplier, life and res, and then the next progression is like double dot multi life, and then the next progression is like double dot multi life, attack speed, and then the next you try to add the chaos res, and then in the end you try to add the arrow. For the helmet, you want to make sure that you have the enchant that is Toxic Rain fires 1 additional arrow. This is the strongest enchant once you have enough AoE, and you should have enough AoE. And you'll be also crafting +1 to socketed AoE gems and 10% increased AoE on the helmet from the crafting bench. That will give you some extra AoE. Also, socketed gems are supported by increased AoE, and increased area of effect on that will also help you to increase your AoE. You can also get nearby enemies have -9 to chaos res. If you remember to stand near the boss, that will be a massive damage boost. You can also get reduced mana reserve, so you need like Shaper and Hunter item. This is pretty much only achievable with like crazy harvest crafting. This is absolutely insane. In the beginning, of course, the progression is like you want life and res, then you want like life and res and have the crafted AoE, and then you want like life and res and have like nearby enemies have -9 to chaos res, and of course craft the AoE, right? So that would be the progression, and then you add the other things. And there's also a bunch of int on this. That's how we are getting all our int requirements. You can also have this int on rings, or you can have lower levels of wither. Carcass Jack we already covered. Gloves, you want to make sure that you're getting the damage over time or chaos damage over time multiplier and attack speed. Gloves are great. We're also going to be crafting increased AoE on them. So in the beginning, again, life and res, that's your base, that's what you're starting with. Then you want like life and res and attack speed and craft some AoE. And then you want like hunter base and get chaos damage over time multiplier. And then if you want to go crazy, you go hunter and warlord base and you keep all of the things before, but you also add on top of that increased damage over time. This is like the best pair of gloves you can possibly get for this build. For boots, in the beginning, you want to start with something like the Atsiri boots with 30% movement speed, life and spell dodge. These are going to be great in the beginning. You really want to prioritize movement speed because it's really important to have good clear speed. It will speed up your farming, it will speed up how quickly you're making currency and how quickly you can actually improve the rest of your gear. So I definitely recommend getting like prioritize Carcass Jack, but then like and the bow, but after that prioritize having like good boots. So two-toned boots, in the end what you want on them is the elusive and tailwind. So of course we have like life, resist, as much movement speed as we possibly can, and the tailwind. And also I recommend getting the enchant increased critical strike chance if you haven't crit recently. This will help you also sustain your tailwind and elusive since we have very low crit chance. So if we didn't crit in a while, that means we don't have tailwind or elusive. That means we're gonna get this boost to them so that we can get them more consistently, right? So this is gonna help you in the beginning, especially like let's say you cannot sustain really high level precision because you don't have enough mana to reserve yet. You're gonna have like a lower level precision. This will help you get the crits more reliably. For the amulet, we of course allocate the hardened scars, and in the beginning you want like life and res. Then later on you want life and res and +1 to level of chaos skill gems. I'd say that's like the most important one. Then you want to get like the +1 to level of skill gems and either malevolence reservation or chaos damage over time multiplier. And then in the end, of course, this is like the ideal amulet, which has chaos.multi, life, all res, which is super efficient, +1 to chaos skill gems, +1 to dex skill gems, and malevolence reservation. And we're also using a catalyst for life and mana modifiers, which not only boosts our life, but it also boosts the mod that reduces the reservation of malevolence up to 30% from like 24 or something, right? So this is very, very important as well to use the right catalysts on that. Absolutely insane amulet. For rings, what you want to make sure is that you get life and res, and this is where you can like fit some extra stats. You can fit the extra strength that you need, you can fit the extra int that you need, and very importantly, try to get as soon as you can curse on hit, despair. That is something that you can craft from like item level 75, so I definitely recommend that. The ideal base is in the end like the vermilion ring, because you can get your resists from something like the cluster jewels later on and other jewels. So resists are always easy to get, so you want to make sure that you get the things that you cannot get in other places. You can never have enough life, so maximum life. Then we've got just regular increased life and strength, increased AoE. That comes from the Warlord base, so Warlord can give you increased AoE on rings as well. We've got the Despair, and increased chaos damage is something that comes from an essence. So this is really not achievable without harvest crafting. You really need to get like crazy either like insanely crazy luck or a lot of tries, because you need to craft the increased chaos damage with an essence, and then also crafted increased damage on top of that. That is absolutely insane amount of damage and AoE in life coming from that ring. And on the second ring, when you can have, as you can see, I have a strength and I have an int, and then we also get, instead of the curse enemies with despair, we have, I think here, the extra chaos res, which we need to cap our Chaos Res here. Very similar ring, just has Chaos Res instead of the Despair Curse. And in this one, we're using like life and mana modifiers catalyst, but with the curse on hit, you can actually use the caster modifier catalyst, and that will increase the effectiveness of the curse that the ring is applying. Now for the belt, I definitely recommend trying to get reduced flask charges used and increased flask effect duration. This will make sure that you can for sure sustain that hallowed hybrid flask forever. With the belt, with these mods, you are going to be spending less charges, which means that the charges you're gaining each second as a Pathfinder are more valuable, and the flask is gonna last longer. Other than that, you want just like chaos damage, which comes from the Hunter mod, and life and res and the increased damage craft. Ideally on a Stygian Vice, because that will give you an extra jewel which you can put accuracy on. For example, the accuracy is going to be really huge because that will help you get consistent hits so that you can apply your curses and get your crits for Tailwind Elusive. So an ideal jewel in that is going to have some accuracy and life, and then also you can get attack speed, and also you can get damage over time while wielding a two-handed weapon, which counts for bows. So next we go to Flask. We're almost done with that. Flasks are extremely important. This flask will be everything for you. At the start, you're going to have just like an instant life flask, and you're going to have enduring mana flask. But later on, you can actually drop the instant life flask, because this flask will be regenerating so much mana and you're going to be constantly having charges for it. So you're going to be absolutely not needing the instant life flask, and you're going to have a lot of avoidance and mitigation. This will like pretty much get you to full life very quickly. So enduring hallowed hybrid flask, you can get it either of heat or you can get it of staunching. You want to make sure that you have somewhere on your gear you have like bleed removal. I think I have one of these flasks. There we go. This is the, I think, silver flask of staunching. So we have staunching here and we have heat here so that we don't get frozen, and we have it constantly up. You can also increase the quality of the flask by the betrayal. So if you use betrayal, I think it's Hillock in research maybe. I think it's Hillock in research, something like that. Look it up. You can increase your flask quality to 26%, and I recommend doing that for at least the enduring hybrid flask, and then also maybe for the Dying Sun, which is another short flask. I recommend Alchemist's Quicksilver of Adrenaline. This will also increase the movement speed, and because we get so much flask duration and so much flask sustain, we can go with the Alchemist flask for the increased effect. This is also very useful for the Quartz flask, because that will give us more dodge, so that like the 25% increase effect means 2.5% attack dodge and a spell dodge. So Quartz flask of warding, which means we're dealing with curses here, and then also silver flask bleeding. Dying Sun, very, very important. You want to make sure that you get it as soon as possible, because this will give you extra AoE and extra projectiles. And also with the flask effect, you'll notice that you are actually getting more projectiles and more AoE. If you have at least 50% increased flask effect, which is definitely what you should be aiming for. Look at everything you have. Look at like Alchemist Genius, for example, that gives you like 20%. Look at everything you have. If you add it all up, and if you have at least 50% increased flask effectiveness, you're going to be getting 3 additional projectiles from this flask, which is absolutely crazy. Now, when it comes to the jewel sockets, I've already explained them, but the one thing to also pay attention to is the corruptions, right? So corruptions on these can be really, really useful, and this is where you're gonna also fill a lot of your resistances. For corruptions, you want like the AoE, right? I think AoE is like the strongest one. 5% increased area of effect. You can also get like cannot be maimed. You can also corrupt these things. These are not corrupted, so we could get even more AoE if we corrupted all of these cluster jewels. But you can get so much of that. You can get so much, like so many stats. You can get elemental resistances on them. So this is something that you can really, really min-max, and that will allow you to free some mods from other items, so that later on you're gonna be able to get like those extra AoE and attack speed and all of that, instead of the resistances, which will instead go on your cluster jewels. And that's about it for this guide. If you have any questions, post them in the comments below. I'll make sure to reply to as many of them as I can. And I would also like to take this opportunity to give big thanks to everyone who's supporting me on all the platforms. We've got a lot of new Patreon supporters who I'm sure are enjoying my leveling loot filters. That makes me really happy that the hard work I put into them is getting put to some use. So I'll continue developing my loot filters because now there are more people using them. Thank you guys so much. We also have a small community of people on Twitch that always hang out there. I appreciate every one of you guys. You can check out my stream at twitch.tv/AsmodeusStream. All the links are in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.